First of all, can you all hear me? Great. All right, excellent. Firstly, 3 points. First thing is thank you for all coming. I know it's been a pretty busy weekend with lots of varying events. So from the Aletheia team, thank you for coming. Also, as the second point, happy Coptic New Year. And the third point, this is a really broad topic and it required a lot of work from the group. But I'd especially like to give thanks to Mina for helping us out, organizing the talk today, and he'll be doing some of the heavy lifting with the reading while I give some of the explanations. All right, so we'll start with the contents first of all. And as Abuna said, the topic is Christian pride versus Christian humility in the secular age. We're going to break it down into 6 main portions. The first part of the discussion is why do we discuss this topic? The second portion is the definitions for a lot of the terminology we use. The third is the biblical references to aspects of humility and pride. The fourth is the non-biblical references. The fifth portion is why should we be humble? And the sixth portion is the conclusion of the summary. All right. Now, before we even begin, we'll start to ask ourselves, why do we need to discuss this? There are some precedents. So from the beginning, we're going to have to assume, as the majority of us are Christians in this discussion today, that we do believe inherently that Christianity is the best moral system. Based on that, we'll be talking about entitlement. So if we do believe that Christianity is the best moral system, are we then entitled to present ourselves as better? And then that connects to the main topic. What is the importance of humility in Christianity? And the third point, is pride appropriate in Christianity? All right, so in terms of perceptions of Christianity from other Christians between denominations, and especially about Christians from non-Christians, there is a bit of a spectrum. So just quickly on that little comic, you're a believer yet you skip the not being a jerk about it part. So there's a lot of concepts built in that small comic, which sort of summarizes how Christians can often miss the finer points. All right, so Mina will read for me 3 main quotes. We'll start this quote from E.S. Denver. Thanks.
The main thing that baffles and angers me about Christians is how they can understand so little about human nature that when in their fervor to convert another person, they tell that person, as they inevitably do in one way or another, you're bad and wrong and evil. They actually expect that person to agree with them. It pretty much guarantees that virtually the only people Christians can ever realistically hope to convert are those with tragically low self-esteem.
All right. You can see that's a little bit strict on us. We'll go into the second quote. This is from S.P. Nashville.
When did it become that being a Christian meant being an intolerant, hateful bigot? I grew up learning the positive message of Christ. Do well and treat others with respect, and your reward will be in heaven. Somehow, for a seemingly large group of Christians, that notion has gone lost. It has turned into the thunders and lights of the wrath of God, and into condemning everyone who disagrees with them to burning in the flames of hell. Somehow, present-day Christians forgot about turning the other cheek, abandoned the notion of treating others like they would like to be treated themselves. They've become bent on preaching, judging, and selfishly attempting to save the souls of others by condemning them. What happened to love, to tolerance, to respect?
And the final quote, just to give you an idea, from DB Atlanta.
I have no problem whatsoever with God or Jesus, only Christians. It has been my experience that most Christians are belligerent, disdainful, and pushy.
Okay. So you can see from all these different opinions, you can find them anywhere in newspapers, on the internet, especially on the internet, that there are a wide view or a broad range of opinions and rather negative opinions about how Christians present themselves. So do Christians genuinely appear entitled? Well, it really depends on what frame we're looking at. Now, if you look from a political or moral standpoint, there is a lot of people of Christian faith who will vocalize their opinions, who will vocalize it in opposition to other belief systems. And then there's also the portrayal in Western media, from science fiction to historical documentaries, that sometimes they can be presented in a holier-than-thou aspect, and so they can often appear entitled or proud. However, because I did mention it was a spectrum, you can also get the other extreme. So you can start off with the overboard humility, where, for example, a lot of Catholic Christians in media or in television series can often be portrayed as having the stereotypical Catholic guilt, thinking themselves the lowest of the low, the absolute sinners. This also permeates in Coptic culture. If you've attended enough church masses, you may see the priests bowing in humility to each other to allow one to continue the service in front of everyone. And sometimes that may be a little bit arduous watching, but it emphasizes how that trait is throughout Christianity. On the complete opposite spectrum, though, there is an elitist behavior that can be procured from certain aspects of different denominations. I've given some examples there. And sometimes it permeates to the point where only that specific sect of that specific denomination believe themselves to be the elect. And even other Christians outside their denomination may not be considered as such. So that can be often perceived as a very proud, very arrogant portrayal. So regardless of the perceptions, we're going to question today, is there a criteria that you can actually use to measure the moral values between Christians and non-Christians? And in the aspect of humility and pride, what do we exactly mean better? So we can leave that for discussion later on. For the purpose of this talk, I might actually do that just because there are quite a few slides. So I'd like you to all keep that in check as we continue on. Now, focusing on that point, humility plays a huge part in Christianity. And we're going to discuss that again as part of the main talk. So following the comic, nobody ever got anywhere by being humble. And the second panel says, of course they did. And then the third panel concludes, we just never hear about them. So there is obviously a sort of paradox that if you are humble, that probably most people won't hear about it. All right, so let's go to the main definition of humility. The quality or condition of being humble. What is being humble? A modest opinion or estimate of one's own importance, rank, worth, etc. Now, these are just sort of generic definitions, but we'll go on to the definition of pride. A high or inordinate opinion of one's own dignity, importance, merit, or superiority, whether as cherished in the mind or as displayed in bearing, conduct, etc. So again, this is sort of, if you open up dictionary.com, Oxford Dictionary, you'll find very similar definitions, and we'll attempt to redefine that. So what does the Bible say about humility? Now, there's a plethora of Bible verses. You can look anywhere in the Bible, or even do a quick Google search, and there are so many numerous references to humility. So I've handpicked a few that might be a little bit more popular in media. So this is from Matthew 18:4. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And the next reference is from James chapter 4, verse 10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Okay, so in slightly introducing humility, we'll also bring in the concept of pride. Now, is pride purely an evil trait? Is it acceptable in some fashion? And again, I've put another comic strip because this might get a little bit dense. So, two people are speaking to each other over cups of coffee, and one says to the other, "What? All I said is that I'm proud of my humility." So, if we start to think about the complexity of where you can draw the line, we start to go back to the Bible about what the Bible says about pride and where it might draw the line. So from Proverbs 29:23, a man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor. Matthew 23:12 says, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And again, back to the book of James, chapter 4, verse 6, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Why is there a taboo about pride? Well, it also goes back to the fall of Satan. A lot of references speak about the fall of Satan, and that the core reason of the fall of Satan from being an archangel, the head archangel, and now becoming Satan himself, was due to his pride. There are obviously biblical references. Now you can see the chaotic nature of that painting there. I thought I'd just put it to sort of add some color, but also to show that it's very reflective of what happens with these two sort of, with a virtue and a vice at odds. So Isaiah 14:12, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. Now I've put an icon or a painting of Archangel Michael stepping on Satan, because in reference to the story of the fall of Satan, the name Michael itself is a question, and Michael questions Satan, who is like God, and translating that, it comes to the name Michael. All right, so the Bible speaks about humility and pride, but there are also within the sources of Christianity, from sayings of saints to even literature, there are a lot of references that refer to the virtues and the vices. Abba Palman says, as the breath which comes out of his nostrils, so does a man need humility and the fear of God. Saint Syncletica also says, just as one cannot build a ship unless one has some nails, so it is impossible to be saved without humility. And then St. John the Dwarf, humility and the fear of God are above all virtues. So there's a lot to go by the references outside the Bible on the importance of such a virtue. And as the last sort of reference puts, that humility might be considered the highest of virtues. So there is a different picture out there from a variety of different Christians, and so it's now becoming a thing, depending on where you read, to acknowledge that humility is essential, not just to the human condition or to specifically the Christian condition, but to everyone. And now our Christian Orthodox understanding might be a little bit more specific. So if we were to speak of humility, I think there's a genuine regard for others more than yourself, and that pride is not just a separate entity, but it's the result of a lack of humility. And the third point is that Christianity ascribes our individual value through Christ, not between others and ourselves. So in judging other people or starting to compare between yourself and another person, it goes against genuine Christian teaching in finding the soul worth of an individual through God. All right, and we do have a few really deep-cut references, so I'll ask Mina to sort of take it from here. This is an Orthodox quote on humility from a source I'll discuss later.
In an age when self-focus is the rule of the day and where the ego seems to reign, it is hard for people to see the value of humility. Many people, from politicians to rock stars, seem to climb the ladder of success by being anything but humble. In our darkened state, with sin dominating our lives and bad habits seemingly insurmountable, holiness seems to be about saints, but unattainable for ourselves. Stuck in our habitual patterns of behavior, we seem to have surrendered all hope for real change. The antidote to this inertia can be found in one simple act, that of repenting. We fall down before our God, confessing our failure at having kept the commandments and asking for God's help in turning our lives around. We commit ourselves to crushing down the ego and acquiring a humble heart. We take every opportunity to accept correction or criticism without becoming defensive. For we know the truth in the words of St. John Climacus, as with the appearance of light, darkness retreats, so at the fragrance of humility, all anger and bitterness vanishes. We refrain from judging anyone, but only examine our own conscience, accusing only ourselves. St. Macarius the Great wrote, Christians therefore ought to strive continually, and never to pass judgment on anyone. No, not upon the harlot on the street, or upon open sinners and disorderly persons, but to regard all men with singleness of intention and purity of eye, so that it may become like a fixed law of nature to despise no one, to abhor no one, to make no distinctions between them. This is purity of heart. When you see sinners or sick people, to have compassion on them and be tender-hearted toward them.
Thanks, Mina. So that was a reference from Abbot Tryphon. He's an abbot in America from the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's, as you can see, it's a very long reference. He uses St. Macarius and St. John Climacus in the same sort of blog that he writes. And this is sort of the generally accepted view of humility. It's a destruction of the self-will and the following of God's will. And in humility, a lot of the other virtues flourish forward. You would say that even within the sacraments in the church, that humility is required. In marriage, there's a great deal of humility. In priesthood, a great deal of humility. And even in baptism, for those who weren't baptized as infants, there is a humility needed to sort of take that leap forward into faith. And again, I'll go back to the Bible because this is sort of the reference point we go back to as collated. So this is Philippians 2, verses 3 and verses 5 to 8. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So, if there wasn't even more evidence to point towards how essential humility was, why be humble? Because God is humble. It was the ultimate sort of definition of being incarnate. It's reflected in the incarnation of the Word. He humbled himself and became man. He took the fallen nature of man and reconciled it to God through the crucifixion. There was a great deal of love, and with a great deal of love comes a great deal of humility. And just on that point, the extent of his death as well as his incarnation was also a humiliating act, and it was something that you would never perceive even a regular person would willingly put themselves through. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That's in reference to Deuteronomy, and it was also quoted in Galatians there on the slide. Now, speaking of which, that comes back down to, are we better than other people? Does God see us as Christians differently from the people around us? We go to the ladder of divine ascent, and then it also states this.
God belongs to all free beings. He is the life of all, the salvation of all, faithful and unfaithful, just and unjust, pious and impious, passionate and dispassionate, monks and seculars, wise and simple, healthy and sick, young and old, just as the diffusion of light, the sight of the sun, and the changes of the weather are for all alike, for there is no respect of persons with God.
Okay. So to summarize, because we've been going through a bit of material, it starts off with humility. If God is humble, and he himself has displayed his humility, not just for a select chosen people, but for everyone, therefore it is logical that Christians in their faith should also be humble towards everyone else, and also humble towards God. Any questions before we go to the next portion? No? Okay. So the next bit, we may have some time to delve into it a bit deeper. But the question is now, I can present to you selected verses about humility, I can present to you selected verses on pride, I can use extra sources, but some people would say, are there contradictions in the Bible? We can pick out verses that selectively point towards the complete opposite. And so we'll address some of these just to give an idea that context is also quite important. And it also refers back, in case of the Orthodox Church, to sources that will help interpret or help translate some of those misunderstandings. So for those who can't see that little comic there, there's a professor speaking to another man saying it is truly it is a tricky theological point. You say you covet your neighbor's humility. So again, we're talking about that paradox on where we draw the line. The first question is, well, you're saying that God is humble, but is he proud? And then there are references that may point towards that. The first being Jethro speaking to his son-in-law Moses in Exodus. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. From the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. And I think some references can be taken out of context when they are actually trying to glorify God instead of saying that God wasn't proud. There are also more specific verses that we'll go into, but the one in Matthew 3:17, during Christ's baptism, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So this was a voice from heaven. Now, do we read it as God being proud of himself, since Orthodox Christianity states that God the Father and God the Son are both essentially God? Or is it a relational thing where God is showing pride in another person, but not so much that it's shrouded out from his true humble nature? And again, we'll leave the discussion towards the end. There are more specific verses which talk less about God and are more about God selecting a chosen people. So in this case, we'll use the first letter from Peter, chapter 2, verse 9. Ina, you can read.
But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
Now, a verse like that was written in the New Testament. It wasn't speaking specifically of the chosen Jewish race in the Old Testament, but rather to God's new people. We would reference a verse, or actually a quote from Father Tadros. If Nina, again, you can read that for me.
Since we are founded on the cornerstone and are attached to him, we are a chosen generation. The apostle of circumcision uttered this statement to correct Jewish misconceptions concerning being a chosen generation, which was that God had chosen them because they were Jews. However, when the Lord incarnated and many Gentiles were from his ancestors, and when he sent his apostles to the Gentiles, God's love was revealed to humanity. Being chosen should not lead to pride and fanaticism, but rather to carrying the responsibility.
Thank you. Did we all get that? Any questions at all? Okay. So with these verses, again, we need a bit of interpretation. Now, we've got a few select verses here, and by taking them individually, it becomes a very difficult thing to sort of justify or even to sort of translate. But if we read on, most of these verses actually do have a contextual reading. 2 Thessalonians 3:14, "And if anyone does not obey our word in this epistle, note that person and do not keep company with him, that he may be ashamed." So on face value, it looks like a very strict verse, causing a lot of segregation, causing that sort of oppositional mistrust in other people. But if you actually read the following verse, it says, "Yet do not count him or those people as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother." And again, you have to sort of read the context of the churches at the time about what was going on and what they were required to do. There was a certain level of restraint they had with either pushing people away or keeping them in. The same thing goes with 1 Corinthians 5:9, a very well-known verse. "I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people." But then following verse 10 and 11 afterwards, "Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother, who is sexually immoral, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person." So this was a very specific commandment for the benefit of the people of Corinth, or the church of Corinth, because a lot of it led to people being led astray. Further in Corinthians, about 10 chapters down, "Do not be deceived, evil company corrupts good habits." Now to Acts 10:28. "Then he said to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or to go to one of another nation, but God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean." So for every verse that you find that may seem to breed an elitist behavior or a behavior of pride, there is another verse to counteract that, to show that no, there's a misunderstanding. Humility is what's needed in these circumstances. In Romans 12:20, "Therefore if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head." So again, back to the paradox. The first half of this verse states that you should be kind. But then the second half shows an intention of ill will, again, if it's misread out of context. Does anyone sort of have any suggestions as to what it might be? Anyone want to have a stab at it? Anyone? Okay. I've got the answer on the next slide. So again, we'll go to Father Tadros in this sort of commentary on that specific verse.
It means coals of the fire of the Spirit of God that purify the enemy through repentance. He comes to comprehend the love you give in return for his hostility. He does not intend us to behave in this manner in order to curse or belittle the adversary, as most would like to believe. Rather, he intends to educate and attract him to repent, as he is conquered by our gentleness. He would surrender to the warmth of love and no longer continues to be an adversary.
So even if the verses can't be found in direct following, referencing a verse that may sound controversial, there's a lot of literature, a lot of external sources which will help refine the definitions or the meanings of those verses from orthodox sources, of course. So to summarize those interpretations, Christ himself kept company with the sinners. He saw the good in them. In reference to Acts 10:28, one of our previous verses, we are advised to avoid sinners or bad company due to our own weakness. So there is, again, that we're not infallible. If we are easily swayed, then it's for our own benefit, not because we're intentionally segregating a person because of our superiority. In conclusion, being Christian improves an individual personally, but does not entitle them to compare their life with others. So in this case, I use a reference from Amba Pumba, which Mina shared kindly with me. If you have a heart, you can be saved. Taking it at face value, there are a lot of assumptions, but it generally means if you are human, then you are capable of repentance, you are capable of being saved. And so, as individuals, we shouldn't judge or condemn another person because everyone has an equal opportunity. There is a fine line between humility and pride. So again, at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of perception. And so we do know that there is a line that we have to draw on what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Galatians 6:14 puts that quite succinctly. But God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. And other than being a fine line between humility and pride, there's also a fine line or a difference between humility and shame. 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So for those who have been with us in Aletheia, you'll realize that this is sort of our slogan verse. We tend to forget that at the very end of it, it also says with meekness and fear. So a combination of humility. Again, just to conclude, it is illogical or contradictory to faith as a Christian to think of oneself to be better than another. However, it would also be illogical as a Christian to not believe that you are following the best moral path. If a Christian was only to believe out of fear or obligation, not love or truth, then it would be disingenuous belief. We as Christians should believe that we are following the truth, but that should not mean we as individuals or as a church are necessarily better. So, the short answer to this, does being Christian mean you are better? No. The core of Christianity requires humility in all its facets to become more like God, or therefore we become more human or more in the image of God. And a Christian who neglects humility adopts a proud nature that distances themselves from God. Any questions?
Thank you so much. My question is, does the very fact that one's belief in Christ and him being central to your life make that man or that man's actions more moral, so to speak, than a non-Christian?
Okay, so I think this might be in a similar vein. So, literally the next slide. These are sort of the 2 points. Is a non-Christian with good virtues better than a Christian with no virtues? Why would a non-Christian become a Christian if they're already better? So, in our group discussion, this was sort of where do we draw the line? Now, there are two ways to see it. Obviously, there's the moral imperative of Christianity. How do you measure that, the morality of Christianity? That's a whole different topic, and I'm sure we've discussed it this year, I think, on morality, or the year before. Yeah, we've done it some time ago, so that's a whole different topic. I think it's a question that we don't necessarily should ask, because if we look at Matthew 7, it says, "Judge not, that you not be judged." So there isn't really a way that we can measure. If you look at the book of Samuel, when God was speaking about King David, he stated that King David has a heart like him, and no other man had a heart like him at the time. So there may be individuals who may have that perception to make that sort of call, but still it's advised for us not to even go there. And so with these sorts of questions, they're a little bit illogical, because it's really none of our business. How do we as individuals have the foresight or the hindsight to actually see and make a call on whether someone is better than us? What truly matters is for the individual Christian in their relationship to God, because ultimately the difference between two people doing the exact same virtues is it in the name of God, or is it in relation to God? The consequence is left up to God's judgment. We are only there as Christians to preach in the variety of different services that we can, or the variety of different gifts. I hope, does that answer the question? Yeah. It's always a great opportunity for everyone to join in.
Just to add a quick thought. In ancient times, people believed everything was made out of 4 elements, air, fire, earth and water. In modern times, we believe, I think we're up to 117 elements or something like that. Okay. Now, you might have had an alchemist from 1,000 years ago who could do things just through, experience and trying things out, and worked out how to do lots of really interesting things. And you might compare them to a Year 7 student today who's using a modern atomic theory but can't do anything as interesting as what the guy from 1,000 years could do. Would you say that the guy from 1,000 years ago should just stick to his 4 elements, or would you say, actually, if he learned modern atomic theory, he could probably do a lot better, even more things? So I mean, that's how maybe an analogy to that first question there. The non-Christian with good virtues is like the guy 1,000 years ago who's doing really interesting stuff with a very bad theory. Whereas the Christian with bad virtues, like with no virtues, is like the modern person who has the right theory but just isn't using it very well. I think most people would agree both of them should get the right theory. So both of them would benefit from being Christian, kind of.
Any other questions? See if I've actually got extra material. So yeah, basically, when we come down to the incarnation, that sort of summarizes everything for us. I had a few extra sources there, but this is more an appreciative sort of literary standpoint on what God will do for us. The difficulty with this topic is that we can go political and talk about the landscape of individuals in media or individuals in politics, but also we can go the spiritual route about the benefits. It's difficult to make a balance, as you can see, and again, we can go forever on this topic. But I think that's basically it. Yeah.
What about patriotism?
Ooh.
Okay,
Yeah.
so if I say, I'm proud to be an Australian, am I being sinfully proud by doing that? Or am I supposed to? As a Christian, should I care about worldly kingdoms and things like that? Should I be like the Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse to salute any flag and refuse to, vote and stuff like that, and say, oh, I'm just not of this world? That seems a little bit fanatical.
That's actually interesting. I didn't know that about Jehovah's Witness. This was part of our discussion as well. Where do you draw the line between sort of, I guess a pride in people other than yourself is more a respect or a reverence for that individuality. So if you're going for a sporting team, for example, again, it's a spectrum. You can choose not to go to any sports or view any sports or become a non-sporty person. The other extreme is that you're so fanatical about it that there's almost an elitist or even violent behavior. You'll often hear about European soccer teams or even in the Olympics, for example, where there are aspects where people take it a little bit too far and that oversteps. I think that you can draw the line there. I don't think personally there's anything wrong with cheering for a team because there is a unity. You have common ground with the people around you. I don't think you can build a genuine relationship halfway across the world if you don't follow the same team, for example. There is a way to build relationships, but I think these sort of smaller, minute areas you can avoid having that sort of proudful nature. It's more of a unity. There's a unity more than pride. Does that make sense?
Aren't you kind of saying my team is better than your team?
I think that's the nature of sport, though, that you can all go for a different team, but sport at its heart, or what modern sport has become, is a respect for all players, and that's where the sportsmanship comes from. It's overstepping it. So thinking that your team or only your team can produce results should always win, where I think there's a general acceptance. Again, there's a humility aspect where you believe your team is great, but there's always room for improvement. And if your team loses, then it should be next season.
Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts about this?
I'm not an expert in sports.
What about pride of race? My race is better than yours.
In the Christian
Racism.
faith, yeah, racism. So, what does Christ say, or what do they say in the New Testament? There is neither Greek nor Jews. There is neither male or female. So, in true Christian faith, it's an abolishment of the ego, abolishment of this sort of segregation, and everyone is joined to Christ. So, obviously, for non-Christians, you can't join them to Christ. You can preach to them Christ, but in terms of being a genuine Christian, race shouldn't be a part of it. I guess in a way, at the core, you shouldn't be too fanatical about your sports teams or any sort of allegiance to any particular group, but something like race where it's based on your biology, that should be more treasured as individuality, but not segregated between groups as a true Christian.
So let's say I have a preference to hang around white people. You know, I don't want to hang around black people or other colours or whatever. So does that make me proud, or is it just a preference?
I guess I'm going to give my personal opinion here, but you have to look at it from how you're raised. If you're only raised around people you're comfortable with, of course you're probably going to gravitate to people that you're comfortable with. But it also depends on how you're raised with your prejudices. So if there's a reasoning behind that, if you're raised to say there's a fault in this particular group of people, then that's highly unchristian, because we're all flawed individuals, and that shouldn't be a reason to segregate yourself. It says, again, earlier in the discussion, do not keep company with people of this nature or of that nature. But that's based on your individual weakness, not necessarily because of their weaknesses. That was a tough question. Any other sort of questions that might be a little bit easier to answer and less opinionated?
One more. This might be an easy one. What about a recognition or an appreciation of your achievements, who you are as a person, the qualities that you have? I understand that God plays a part, like you can't do anything without him, but to an extent you open the door a little bit.
Again, I think it comes back down to the core of Christianity, which is a destruction of the ego, not necessarily self-will, because you actively choose to follow God, but there's an appreciation of the talents God has given you, and there are a lot of parables about using your talents wisely, and then God glorifying the wisely used talents of those individuals. But then there's also the excessiveness where if you build that habit of pride and that sort of self-esteem and building yourself up to the point where you believe this is purely from your own effort and from your own energy, then that takes you away. Again, drawing back to the conclusion, it's a facet of separation from God. So it depends, where do you draw the line? You draw it in the beauty and the appreciation. You can adopt that aspect of pride, or you can be humble, where you know that you have the talents, but you think of it less about your own efforts, and you say God permits it to happen, or God allows these moments to happen. So there are those two extremes. And as Christians, I think, if based on the readings and the references, it would be better to adopt a more humble personality more than a lack of humility. So again, it's a spectrum. That was still a difficult question.
So what about Muhammad Ali when he said that he's the greatest?
Oh.
So is that humble or not? Or is it proud?
I guess it's pride. But then again, what if, yeah, the question is, we were speaking about using measurable traits. How do we actually measure if someone's better than another? I don't think he was the greatest human being, if that's what he was saying. But he was saying if he was the greatest boxer, then that is statistically probably a good argument you could put forward. And that's something you can measure. But it's also a huge dose of opinion as well. How he portrays that statistic. Yeah, and that's what it comes to. Again, and yeah, and there's a verse in Isaiah chapter 55. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's ways higher than our thoughts, and his ways higher than our ways. So he perceives things on a totally different plane. And again, it comes down to us really, as Christians, the best benefit is that we don't actually have to judge anyone. It's just, unfortunately, what's developed over time is that we think we do have to judge, where the genuine pleasure of being a Christian is that you don't need to. Any other questions?
Muhammad Ali is a really interesting example, actually. He only died a little while ago, and they had a documentary on him that I heard on the radio.
Yeah.
He did a lot of good for a lot of people. And one of the things that he did was attract a lot of publicity and use that publicity to make a point about some really big moral issues. So, he was a conscientious objector. He refused to fight in the Vietnam War. He fought a lot for black people to be respected. This is back in the 60s and 70s when being black in America was, Martin Luther King was fighting for equality and all that sort of stuff. So he actually, there is a question as to whether when he said, "I am the greatest," it's very unlikely that he was just saying that because he's really full of himself, kind of thing. He seems to have been doing that much more as a kind of a publicity stunt to get media attention so he could then use that platform to try and make the world a better place. So I think that highlights the complexity sometimes.
Yeah, that's a whole different field in sports psychology about individuals. Again, yeah, you can see it in so many different facets. Is he self-advertising like many modern stars will do in whether it's wrestling or martial arts or even in aspects of soccer or basketball, where a personality is what drives sales? There's an economic value to that, but there might be an individualistic value for a person's own worldview. So I agree with that.
Okay, so we're going to be okay with Muhammad Ali, it looks like. I don't know, maybe you can discuss him a bit more if you want. It also though brings up the question which I think a lot of people, particularly Christians, think about personally. In a lot of careers these days, you're not really going to get very far unless you sell yourself. You're not going to get promoted, you're not going to get a good job, because there are other people who are out there telling everybody how good they are. And if you're not doing that, you have a distinct disadvantage. So I wonder what people think about that. What does the Christian do in that situation? Do you play the game, knowing that that's just what you have to do to get along? Or do you not and suffer the consequences? What do you think? Someone has.
I think if you have nothing to show, there's no point of saying anything. So, if you have nothing to show, there's no point of saying you're better than that you're.
I'm assuming you have some abilities. Do you sell them?
Do you extrapolate or exaggerate your abilities? That's a good question.
Yeah, I guess if it's.
Not even exaggerate, just tell people about
Yeah, I think it's okay. Yeah. It's okay, like, you see an opportunity for a promotion. Close, not close, but you tell your achievements to, upper management or whatever, and I think that's okay. So, as long as you're not trying to, like, put people down or, like, try to stop others from getting to where you want to get.
I'd say there's a difference between the quantitative values that you put on your resume and the qualitative values. The quantitative values are the quantitative values are definitive. You can say if you were the highest, the best-selling salesperson in your company for 3 months straight. There's no exaggeration there. That's not an aspect of pride. That is a statistical fact you've got. However, when you're sitting in an interview saying, I'm better than everyone else, that may have only been you for 3 months in a row, and then you were placed last in terms of sales for the remainder of the year. So.
Okay, but they may actually ask you in the interview, tell me why I should hire you. Why are you better than all the other applicants? What do you do there?
I think I'll let Nina answer this.
I don't know, I might get in trouble saying this, but I think you should be actually selling yourself and possibly even exaggerating. I think that you should. Well, because I think it's not, you're not talking about yourself as being a human being, you're selling a product, and that's kind of how I've kind of been taught as well in some classes about how to get ahead and resumes. You're selling a product, which is your ability to do a job. So an employer is looking to, in a way, purchase a product. They want to get someone that can do this job. You're like, some sort of equipment for them that can, when you're going to go buy a car, you want to know which is the best car I'm going to buy or which is the best photocopier. So you've got to and there's a bit of marketing involved in that. You've got to convince them that you are the best person to be doing this. So you've got to kind of, portray your best, attributes for doing that job. And I don't think that's really a prideful thing. I think it's more about you've attained some skills in this profession, allegedly. So you want to be able to convince them that you're able to do this job and you want to be able to do it well. And I don't think that makes you proud, that, you can do this. I think if you do it like in a kind of an objective way and try and convince them, that's something that's okay. I think where it might not be okay is it's a bit of a dog-eat-dog world in some cultures, and I think that's where it becomes a bit more about pride, that you deserve to be having the top job and you deserve to, be on top of everyone else and you deserve this, and so you'll do anything to get it and, lie, cheat, steal, push the other guy, throw that guy under the bus. And I think that's maybe where it becomes, an unethical behavior. But in terms of trying to,
stand out.
Yeah, stand out and flash your achievements to get a job, I don't think that's a prideful thing. I think you need to do that. You need to convince them why should they hire you. If you're not going to tell them, then they're not going to hire you.
Do we have any potential disagreements here?
So I don't disagree, but I think employers who would ask you to sell yourself more to convince them, maybe it's because they're looking for confidence in the role. So the specific role they're hiring for requires some authority or some marketing ability. But I think a lot of the time, answering that may not be relevant because your past experience or your resume or whatever you're showing to them should speak for itself, and that is something that is fairly quantitative because it's just the fact what you have done in the past that's leading up to this role, and they can make their decision based on that. And if they want the confidence in it, then maybe that's just a trait of the position of the career or the path that they're on.
So what you're saying is that they may not necessarily be examining you for the questions that they're actually questioning you about. They're actually seeing how you respond or how you tolerate it. Well, that's an interesting way of seeing it. That usually is a technique that they'll use.
I think in some roles that could be important to them. How do you react in a situation where you do need to sell yourself? If, for example, you're somebody who's selling something in the role, but in other situations it may not be important to express your abilities to them in a way there's like a selling mentality.
Can I use a pop culture reference sort of to build up on that? This is totally unrelated, but since we're on the matter of humility and pride, I'll indulge myself a bit. In that reference, I don't know if anyone will agree with me. If anyone's seen the first Men in Black film, you have Will Smith in the starring role, and at the beginning of the film, they're trying to select an individual to take on the extraterrestrial work that the Men in Black do. And you'll see that there are a lot of individuals who are lined up for this interview. They all seem to be ex-military, highly experienced, and you have Will Smith, who's a street cop. He takes a very different approach to this interview process, and when they're all given guns to target suspected extraterrestrials on a sort of target range, Will Smith targets just one and only shot at a mannequin of a child, and controversially they all react, asking, why did you do this and why did you approach it? And he took a tactful situation, he exaggerated his skills, but pointed towards the psychology textbook in the young infant's hands and said, that's very suspect. An extraterrestrial would probably want to know a little bit more, and an infant would probably want to know a little bit less on human psychology. So I don't know if that's any relevance, but that seems like a very tactful way of saying maybe it is a dog-eat-dog world, but you've got to take different approaches, but very morally acceptable ones, I think, as well. Any other questions? I completely threw you off with that reference.
There's a very interesting sort of position in the Olympics, since we're on to modern circumstances, where you had all of these people who were banned for using drugs to try and get an unfair advantage, and then you contrasted that with, I don't know if you saw the race, the ladies running race, where one of them tripped over or something and the other one stopped and went back to help her up, and so on. I just thought that's a really interesting contrast, isn't it? On the one hand, you have people trying to get an unfair advantage over others. On the other hand, you had people who kind of said it's more important to be kind and compassionate than it is to win the race. And yet they're both competing. Like, it's the same race, they're both competing under the same rules in the same place, and everything. Maybe that's a good sort of metaphor for...
It's a very real-world reflection on, again, the spectrum between the humility and pride.
So, I mean, it may be okay to sell yourself, but not if you're going to go to the point of making up things or, stuff like that. So I don't know if the exaggeration, I don't know if I'd be that comfortable with it. By all means, say the truth, but don't sort of exaggerate it. I think that would be an unfair advantage, or you can disagree if you like. And I also think, I don't know, even if it's required of you, I don't know if it would be a Christian thing to do to put others down, to make yourself look better, which sometimes is kind of what's expected of people. But I think that would be a case where you're better off losing the race, rather than...
Yeah, I think I agree with not putting others down, but I think exaggeration is not... I'm not saying make things up, but I think it's important to maybe stress features that you have to make them seem better. You know what I mean? Like, if you have a product, you want to highlight the good things about it. You want to say, look how great this thing is. And I think that's what you kind of want to do in a job, is say, oh, look how great this is, and make them believe that it is actually a really good thing. And I think that, and I mean, like you were saying, maybe that's not important in all roles, but I think it's if there's two people up for an interview and they have pretty much equal qualifications, it's human nature that people don't just look at numbers and make decisions on numbers. In the same way they're going to pick a candidate, it's the kind of the same way they're going to pick anything. It's about marketing. And that's why companies have huge budgets for marketing. They've got to convince people that this is good. And I think that's the same with you. You've got to convince these people that, there's all these numbers and stuff, and look at my qualifications, but so what? You've got to convince them about it. And I mean, I'm not saying make things up and say, oh yeah, I can do this and you really can't. But I think maybe stressing how, your good points and things like that is what I'm...
Isn't that why everybody's very cynical about marketing these days? Isn't that why everyone's very cynical about politicians and we don't believe anything they say? Because they're doing exactly what you said?
I think politicians are a different kettle of fish completely. I think that's beyond marketing. They're just trying to make everybody happy without and by dodging answers and things like that. And I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think there's honesty involved, but at the same time, I think it's more about just all I can say is you got to try and convince them, and so you got to, you know, the same way you could try and convince anyone of anything. You'd be honest about it, but you'd be focusing on the strengths, I would say.
So you're not really saying exaggerate as in say things that are not true. No.
Did we all hear that? Okay. Any other questions?
I was just going to ask about humility and pride in relation to spiritual gifts. So, like some churches do courses on them or put quite a lot of emphasis on it, whereas somewhere I read it might be Coptic monks that have pray not to have the gifts, so because of pride, I guess, maybe? Or?
Yeah, there's a lot of interpretations. There's one saying that says, rather than asking to be exceptional in one specific virtue, ask God that you are slightly competent in the remaining virtues instead of one particular one. I think that goes back to different schools of thought, but also comes down to not, again, destruction of self-will or destruction of the ego. So by asking for virtues, we may be asking for things that we ask amiss of. So ask and you shall receive. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss. So that, again, is a whole different aspect on asking God for things that are good for us or things that we think we need. I don't think it's inherently wrong to ask to be virtuous, but it's for the underlying purpose of acquiring that virtue that brings into question why you would want it. Any other questions or any disagreements? That was a good question.
Hanging out with people. No, keeping company with sinners.
Interpretation. Christ himself kept company with sinners. So as God, he not only humbled himself through the incarnation, he not only humbled himself through the crucifixion, but he also became an example by sitting with what people perceived as sinners. The Son of Man, John the Baptist came and served the people, and they said things about him. The Son of Man came and sat down with sinners, and they said, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors, etc., etc. And so the perception from the outside world is God was hanging with the wrong crowd for the wrong reasons, whereas we saw that he was presenting ultimately love to the outcasts. And by that example, we should also go out to those who are considered outcasts. But for our own individuality, if it compromises our relationship or we start distancing ourselves from God, that's when self-assessment is an essential part of us being a Christian as well.
So you're saying that's where easily swayed Christian?
Yeah, I think the benefit of us having, being in the Orthodox church is that we have a very rigorous pastoral care system that we can, if we're given the opportunity, we take good advantage of. We not only have our fathers of confession, considering the fact that confession used to be a public sort of service where the individual would stand in front of the crowd of the congregation, would say his sins and then would be absolved. Now it's a lot more private and personal. But we also have sort of leadership roles between men and women, giving suitable advice about how we should approach our spiritual lives. We have opportunities to give talks, more structured and focused on apologetics and more spiritual. Would you like to ask the last question, Will?
There was a very interesting discussion recently on Facebook about whether it's a good idea to reward kids for doing things like reading their Bible. You know the thing that we do in Sunday school.
Yeah.
Kids, if you read 10 chapters of the Bible this week, we'll stand you in front of the class and we'll give you a present and we'll say what a jolly good person you are and things like that. And some people were saying, yes, that's a good thing to do. You need to do that, and it builds up their confidence and gets them into good habits. And other people were saying, but you're actually also paying a very big price when you do that. You're teaching them basically to do good things so that they get recognised and so that everybody, and then they get a big head about it and they say, I read my 10 chapters, you didn't, and so on. I don't know. I'd be interested to know what people think about that. Do people have opinions about that? Is it a good thing to do, or is it a dangerous thing to do? What do you think?
Should we breed a culture of being proud in ourselves and expecting gifts?
Well, across people's lives, they're going to have so many people insult them for not reading the Bible. So maybe we need to build up their confidence and their pride in reading the Word of God earlier on, so that they know that it's worth reading. Because later on, when people tell them, you're a fool for reading something like that, then they can actually say, no, well, I believe in it. Kind of thing. I don't know.
I think the awesomeness of the Bible itself will kind of show itself. So in the sense that maybe at the start we might need to praise them and give them gifts or whatever, and like put them in front of the class and stuff, just so that they can allow that seed to flourish in their hearts, I guess. Because the Bible will defend itself. Like, it doesn't need anything to defend. It doesn't need anything to say that this is really good or that you should read because you're going to get a prize. Because it on its own, I think it's its own reward. But I think as a start, it might be necessary just so that they can have that taste.
Anyone else? I'm Scott. Yeah. Brilliant.
It's not a proper answer to it, but in one of these or the Spring is Love one, someone wrote a whole column about that, and I think I can't remember the whole response, but I think they were saying generally it wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
That's actually the reference that we were talking about. Yeah.
I don't remember all the reasons, but I read it and I thought, it's a lot of sense.
So what makes sense for you?
Well, he was talking about, because it can then go into other things, I think, so expecting rewards for other things, not just that, so it then does other behaviour, I think.
I think one example was that if I am true to God by going to church every Sunday, doing a certain number of services, observing strict fasts, then I will definitely find a future partner, or I will be given a successful career, or I'll achieve certain marks in examinations and study. I think, was that one of the examples as well?
Maybe, but yeah, it was more like if, just rather than just being asked to do it because it's a good thing to do, or you should do it for those reasons, then it's got like a dollar value to it. Making money important.
Any comments on that? I personally think there's a transitional period. I think this is in reference to how you raise your children. I'm no expert on child psychology, but I think if you teach them the inherent reward, as was stated, about just reading the Bible or following the tenets of the church or the instructions of the church, that there's a value to it that is greater than any physical reward, and it's just slowly transitioning over time from that physical reward and building that association where people can willingly choose. Who am I to say? Anything else?
If we still have time, do you want to go through there's a couple more slides? Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So
how are we going for time?
Okay. So we do have a few stories towards the end. These are like the sayings or the stories of the Paradise Fathers or the Desert Fathers. So if I can find them. Okay, so the following stories are both from St. Macarius. We'll read the first one. Would anyone care to read?
A brother came to see Ava Macarius the Egyptian and said to him, Ava, give me a word that I may be saved. So the old man said, go to the cemetery and abuse the dead. The brother went there, abused them, and threw stones at them. Then he returned and told the old man about it. The The latter said to him, "Didn't they say anything to you?" He replied, "No." The old man said, "Go back tomorrow and praise them." So the brother went away and praised them, calling them apostles, saints, and righteous men. He returned to the old man and said to him, "I have completed them. I have complimented them." And the old man said to him, "Did they answer you?" The brother said, "No." The old man said to him, "You know how you insulted them, and they did not reply, and how you praised them, and they did not speak? So you too, if you wish to be saved, must do the same, and become a dead man. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of men or their praises, and you can be saved."
So again, the destruction of self-will and sort of a reactionary response. So this was a lesson in humility, a very well-known story by St. Macarius. Now the next story is in a little bit of Old English. We do apologize, I couldn't find the modern translation in time. But we can certainly have a read of it.
They say that other Macarius the Egyptian on one occasion went up from Skete to the Nitrian mountain, and as he drew nigh unto a certain place, he said unto his disciple, "Pass on a little in front of me." And when he had done so, there met him a certain heathen priest, who was running along and carrying some wood about the time of noon. And that brother cried out to him and said, "O minister unto devils, whither runnest thou?" And the priest turned round and smote him with many severe blows, and he left him with but very little breath remaining in him. And he took up his wood and went on his way. And when he had gone a little further, the blessed Macarius met him on his journey and said unto him, "Mayest thou be helped, O man of labours?" And the priest was astonished, and came to him and said, "What fair thing hast thou seen in me, that thou shouldest salute me in this gracious fashion?"
I might take it from there just because the font thing is a little bit smaller. And the old man said unto him, "I see that thou toilest, and that thou dost not know that thou art toiling for naught." Then he said unto the old man, "At thy salutation I also was very sorry, and I learned that thou didst belong to the great God, but a wicked monk met me just before thou didst, and he cursed me, and I smote him even unto death." And the old man knew that it was his disciple of whom he spoke. And the priest laid hold upon the feet of Macarius and said unto him, I will not let thee go until thou makest me a monk." And they came to the place where the brother was lying, and they carried him and brought him to the church of the mountain. Now when the fathers saw the heathen priest with him, they marveled that he had been converted from the error which he had held. And Macarius took him and made him a monk, and through him many of the heathen became Christians. And Abba Macarius said, "An evil word maketh wicked, even when those who are good, and a good word maketh good, even when those who are wicked, as it is written." And that was basically it. I sort of cut it off from there. Okay. I think that's a good point to sort of end on, unless there's any other questions. So yeah, the story, just to summarize from the Old English, there was a monk who was a disciple of St. Macarius. He was walking past a non-Christian leader. He insulted him, got physically abused to the point where he was almost dying. And then as St. Macarius approached this man on a separate occasion, he complimented the hard work of this individual who was carrying wood and worshipping. And by complimenting him, he won him over, by just simply not judging him. And in that point... Exactly. Yeah, so, and that's the difference between the maturity of the master and the disciple. I hope everyone liked that story and the Old English didn't turn you off. But
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ragaei and Mina, for running the session today, wherever he's gone. There he is. Very interesting. The moral of the story is, if you meet a pagan priest carrying wood, don't insult him. Very, very big message to take home today. Our next meeting is going to be on the 2nd of October, which apparently is on a long weekend, but it's such a good meeting, you'll want to make sure you don't go out of town and make sure that you're here. We have John Dixon coming to us. He is one of the people at the Centre for Public Christianity. He's a famous author. He's written lots of books. He does podcasts and stuff like that. He often writes in the newspapers, articles and so on. I believe he also teaches at, I'm not sure where it was, I think it was at Sydney Uni or something like that. He lectures. So he's one of the foremost modern Australian apologists for Christianity. And we're really, really happy that he's agreed to come and talk to us from in the midst of a very busy schedule. So it should be a really exciting night. That's 2nd of October, the usual time. We gather at 6 and start at 6:30. So thank you all for coming today. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you guys for presenting a very interesting topic.
Also on the